Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go ahead and get started. The issues that surround airports and seaports and railways are very complex, and the way that they are handled obviously have huge implications for our state's future economic health. So it's a pleasure to welcome our second panel, and they're going to come out one by one. Ed Emmett has served as the Harris County Judge since 2007, and Judge Emmett has a long history in transportation issues, including as a member of the Transportation Committee in the Texas House of Representatives and as a commissioner at the Interstate Commerce Commission. It's a real honor to welcome you, Judge. Robert Eccles is Judge Emmett's immediate predecessor as Harris County Judge, and Judge Eccles has had a distinguished career in the Texas House as well, and most recently serves as president of Texas Central High-Speed Rail. The judge has a long history of work in the public and private sector, bringing folks together on large infrastructure initiatives, and we're glad to have him as well. Linda Watson serves as president and CEO of Capital Metro here in Austin. Linda has more than 25 years of experience in transportation policy and leadership in Orlando, Florida, Corpus Christi, and Fort Worth. Linda was key in Austin's light rail success, which you can see right outside the front door of the hotel here. Linda, we appreciate you being with us. Phil Ritter joined DFW Airport in 2009 as Executive Vice President of Governmental and Stakeholder Affairs. Phil directs public policy work for DFW Airport, including community and media relations. And prior to joining DFW Airport, Phil served 20 years at Texas Instruments, where he was Senior Vice President for Public Affairs with global responsibility for government and community relations. Since 1994, John LaRue has served as the Executive Director of the Port of Corpus Christi Authority. And as Executive Director, he oversees the day-to-day operations of one of our state's and nation's largest ports. John serves on numerous boards, including as the chairman of the TxDOT Port Advisory Commission. We're glad to have John with us. Roger Nober was appointed Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad's Executive Vice President and also the Board Secretary in 2007. From 2002 to 2006, Roger served as chairman of the U.S. Surface Transportation Board. And prior to this, Roger served as a counselor to the Secretary and the Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Transportation. And finally, I'm proud to introduce our moderator and a fellow Lyceum director. This is a tough panel both because of the range of topics to be discussed, but also the fact that he has his current boss and his past boss on the panel. Nevertheless, Russ Frank is a gifted leader, and he currently serves as the interim chief of staff for the Metropolitan Transit Authority of Harris County. He began his service at Metro in 2000, and he's held key positions in government affairs, community outreach, and planning. I want to thank all of our panel for being here, and Russ, go get them.
All right, thanks, Mike. Well, we had a great panel this morning about highways, and we're going to talk now about some other modes of transportation. We have some of the largest airports, some of the largest seaports, and transit systems in the country. Texas is first in the country in railroad mileage. Our ports rank first in tonnage. We're talking about some new modes of transportation now, like high-speed rail and some other types of transit in the state. And today we're fortunate to have a great panel that is a diverse panel of experts. And we're going to start off by having a few opening comments from each of the panelists, and they can tell about their particular interest and their particular mode of transportation of their organization. So I'm going to start on the far end with Judge Emmett.
Well, thank you, Russ. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. Thank all of you for coming. I'm wearing several hats this morning. I know I'm Harris County Judge, and Harris County is the third largest county in the United States. But I come from a background of transportation and freight, and I think it's important to note the interconnectedness of all of it. I use the analogy all the time, and I apologize to those of you who've heard me use it many, many times. But when you go to the doctor, your health is largely determined by the flow through your veins and arteries. Well, the same's true of the economy. The economic health of our region, our state, and our nation is largely determined by the flow of goods through the transportation system. And even though we've had two separate panels this morning, they all tie together. And if you look at where we are as a state right now, we are perfectly positioned to be the gateway of North America. The globalization of commerce is continuing unabated. If you look back and see the changes that have come with containerization and ships coming into the ports, you realize that that is our future. And if we in Texas don't take advantage of that future, then that commerce is going to go somewhere else. So it's very important that we understand that all the modes of transportation tie together. And I'll give you one little example because the Panama Canal was mentioned earlier. Let's say an 8,000 TEU ship comes into the Port of Houston. Assume that even though it's 8,000 TEUs, maybe there are only really 5,000 boxes on it because a lot of them are 40-foot boxes. Let's assume half of those are going to go to the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Well, that's 2,500 containers from one ship. Now, those can either go by truck on 2,500 different trucks, or they can go by trains, and I'll leave it to Roger to tell you exactly how many trains that would involve. But so it's important that we build the infrastructure to handle that growth, because if we don't, the growth is going to go somewhere else. And so that's why I'm pleased to be part of this panel, but I would encourage everybody to understand no mode exists by itself. They all have to tie together.
All right, Judge Eccles.
And again, thanks for being here, and I'm honored to be sitting here by the real judge today. And following along that theme, and the theme of the earlier panel, the idea that there are many modes that work together. We have, as Ed today chairs the HGAC Transportation Policy Council, I did that. We had Michael Morris earlier talking about the regional planning and working together. We always hear people coming in with a solution to the transportation problem, the challenges facing us. It's highways, the guys with the toll roads come in with their toll road solution, the hike and bike people, the railroads, the commuter rail, the transit, the hike and bike people. And the challenge is to make them understand that everybody's right, that there is a place within the system for all of these modes of transportation. And the one that I'll be working on and talking about more today is high-speed rail as a transformational technology. In most of the things that we work with, we nibble at the edges about changing the way people move around. And better bus service that my grandmother took back 50 years ago when I'd go visit her at her house to go to Foley's downtown. My grandmother actually lived in Houston and didn't have a car. But those things have all been ways that we get around and traditionally get around. And in the United States, the high-speed rail truly has the ability to transform our economy and our way we work together in our large urban centers. The project we're first starting off is the Dallas-Fort Worth to Houston corridor. It has both ends close to 7 million people today, and it'll be close to 20 or 25 million people by 2030. David Laney told us this morning, and Mr. Christensen from TTI, that there just weren't going to be enough lane miles to accommodate all of that. And it's exciting, the idea that we could, in less than 90 minutes, in fact, our modeling today is about 78 minutes, I think, travel door to door from the central areas of both of those metropolitan regions, faster, in fact, than I can drive from my house in Spring to downtown Houston today in a commute. So it's an exciting prospect, and it's important, though, as we move through these prospects, that we understand, as Judge mentioned, how we all interact to provide a more efficient system.
All right, Linda.
Thank you, Russ. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I want to welcome those of you to Austin who are visiting with us today. I'm privileged to be able to speak on behalf of transit this morning. Capital Metro is the transit system here in Travis County, some of Williamson County, and we provide over 33 million annual trips. We implemented commuter rail line in 2010, and since opening date, we have more than tripled ridership on that rail line. And part of the reason for that is Austin remains the #1 city in the country in terms of growth, as Texas does in terms of growth. And we are looking at somewhere around 150 people moving to Austin every single day. That's putting 70 cars on the road every day, cars that weren't there before. And it provides us even more opportunities and challenges for moving people in this region. As so many of our communities are experiencing, people are moving further and further out from the core of the city because of home prices. But in Austin, for example, everybody is traveling to the core to go to UT, the state capital, or downtown Austin to work. We have a tremendous congestion problem in that most of our trips are coming from the north into downtown, but our roadways are constrained, and we can squeeze some capacity out of our roadways, but not enough to have free-flowing traffic. In fact, the studies have shown that we would need 14 lanes southbound, 12 lanes northbound to handle the traffic problems that we have today, not what's coming for the future. So many people in our region have realized that transit needs to be a part of the solution to our congestion problems. One of our local economists recently said that we probably have 5 years in Austin to deal with our mobility challenges before we start losing companies. They start looking at places like Charlotte, Nashville, and others to relocate because we are in gridlock. And I know that's not where the state wants to go. Certainly Austin is not interested in that. So it's going to take all of us together working to try to solve these problems.
Phil?
Well, thank you, Russ. It's an honor to be here representing aviation. My friend Dennis Christensen showed a picture of the Wright brothers at Kill Devil Hill as part of his presentation, and he described it as two idiots holding onto the wing of an airplane for dear life, not sure whether they're going to live or die. And I got a lot of friends in the aviation business, especially in the airline industry, that say nothing's changed in 100 years. But anyway, airports are certainly a very, very important factor in the Texas economy. There are 25 commercial airports in the state of Texas. We've recently organized the Texas Commercial Airports Association. You can think of them as anywhere that Southwest or American or Delta or United flies, but there are also 274 general aviation airports in the state, and collectively we sustain over 714,000 jobs and $45 billion worth of annual economic impact. And one way to think about airports is we're really partners and enablers, if you will, for tourism and economic development and a key part of the state's economy. Airports are one element, along with airlines and governments, in the global air transport system. You may wonder, how is it that these aluminum tubes can fly all over the world at 600 miles an hour, 35,000 feet, and land anywhere in the world? Well, in 1944, at the end of World War II, the victorious nations came together and they signed something called the Chicago Treaty, which is a multinational treaty, and it established the International Civil Aviation Organization. And ICAO sets the standards and recommended practices for governments and airports all over the world in terms of aviation. And so all of our airports are part of that global system. And airports are really a platform for airlines to compete upon and for our partners, be they government, concessionaires like food and beverage, and other partners to perform their functions in a cost-effective and safe setting. There's a lot going on in the airline industry. We've got a lot of policy issues that we're dealing with in Washington, and hopefully we'll have the chance to get into some of that during the Q&A. Good to be here.
All right, John?
Thanks, Russ. It's good to be here and represent the port side of the transportation infrastructure for our state. 90% of foreign trade moves through ports. And as Russ said, Texas has more of that than any other state. We have 14 deep water seaports and a number of shallow draft seaports from Orange to Brownsville. They operate independently while they're all set up, except for Galveston, by state legislation, the water code. Once the state sets them up, kind of push them out of the nest, operate independently, either with an elected board or an appointed board. And for the past, I would say, 3-4 decades, ports have pretty much operated under the same conditions and with the same cargo base, some changes. That's dramatically changed in the last 2 years with the energy revolution that's going on in the United States with shale formations. We have a significant change in the way we operate. I can tell you from our port up until this point, we were an import port. We have about 7% of the U.S. refining capacity, 3 major refineries. They were traditionally bringing in 90% of the oil was imported, coming from the Middle East, from Africa, from the North Sea, from Venezuela. We saw last year a 15% dip in imported oil. We saw a tremendous influx in Eagleford shale oil coming into our port, coming in by pipeline. There's not enough pipeline, so it's coming in by truck. Some of it coming into Texas ports by rail, by unit trains. So a dramatic change. That changes the operation of the port. So instead of those large tankers that you see coming in, we're handling a different type of oil that's going to other refiners in the U.S. under different rules and regulations. And it's really going to change the way ports operate. The other side of that is the gas that's in those formations. We're going to see Texas has got at least 3 major LNG facilities that are going through the permitting process right now to export natural gas. One of the key factors in whether we can do that, besides the U.S. government saying they can with a permit, is the Panama Canal. Because right now, 80% of the LNG fleet cannot get through the canal. When the canal is expanded in 2015, 80% of that fleet will be able to get through the canal. And you'll see a tremendous demand for U.S. gas in Asia, in India, throughout the whole, and even in Europe, they're looking at it. We're also starting to see an influx of new industry coming in because of that supply of gas. Not only is it cheap, but most of the companies that we're dealing with, and we're dealing with 3 international companies that want to build new facilities in our port, it's because of the stability of the U.S. market. They don't have to worry about someone in another part of the world turning off the spigot and shutting down their operation. So there's, for your ports, you're going to see tremendous change in the next 5 years.
All right, Roger.
Well, I work for BNSF Railway, which is the nation's largest freight railway by volume, and we're headquartered in Fort Worth, Texas, and we have 42,000 employees, and our revenues are something along the order of over $20 billion. So we're frankly the largest freight railroad in the world, and we're a little bit different than everybody else in this panel in that we are a private company. We're owned by Berkshire Hathaway. We own all of our right-of-way, and all of the capital that goes into buying rail cars, hiring employees, and building capacity are paid for by our owners, and we have to earn a return on those. So just to kind of give you a sense of things, we're going to spend about $4.1 billion in capital this year. We would be one of the top 10 states in terms of DOTs for the amount of spending that we do. We have about 33,000 route miles of track across the western 2/3 of the United States, and if you rolled it all up into one size, we'd have about 112 square miles of real estate, so we'd be bigger than the state of Rhode Island. So the important thing, though, to all of that is that we're a private company, and we have to earn our money by hauling freight. Now, we carry, all sorts of commodities, and our business is a pretty good kaleidoscope of what's going on in the economy as a whole. You've heard reference to containers, and we carry more intermodal containers than any other railroad, principally off the West Coast, but coming from all over the country, going to all over the country. We have an energy business that a few years ago was non-existent, and principally on our railroad in the Bakken Shale up in North Dakota, but all over, including the Permian and the Eagle Ford and Niobrara and you name it. We're now going to be carrying, by the end of the year, close to 200 unit trains of oil, which our first one was 18 months ago. So it's really just incredible how we've seen the growth in oil. By the same token, our coal business, which was principally for electricity generation, is down about 20%. And then finally, our agricultural products business has been, what goes into food. About half is domestic and about half is export, and we've seen that substantially lessened as a result of the drought. But the important thing is that we're dependent on the economy. We have interestingly worked with almost every person on this panel in some form or another, so we interface with almost every other mode, but we have a different parameter for looking at things because we're privately owned and we have to earn a return on what we do.
Well, as you see, our panel are from all different modes of transportation. And so now I'm going to pose some questions to the panel and see how they can give some responses back on what their views are on some of these issues. We've talked a lot about moving goods and moving freight. So is this emphasis on freight and intermodal going to increase in the future, and how are we going to deal with that? Anyone can take the question.
Well, maybe I'll start with that one. Our intermodal business is really, there's 2 halves of it. The first is international intermodal, so things that are coming essentially on the water into a port and being translated onto a train. And to answer Judge Emmett's earlier question, we carry about 300 containers on a fully loaded train, so it would be about 8. I think that my math is right. So that it's just the efficiency of carrying containers on an intermodal train when we would basically be supplanting 300 trucks is just compelling. And we can carry a ton of freight about 800 miles on a gallon of diesel fuel. So we are just incredibly efficient. But with rail, the handling, taking it on and off the container is expensive and time consuming. So you want to handle it as few times as possible. The second place where we're seeing a lot of intermodal, really our growth area, is in domestic intermodal. So that would be what you consider truck trips that are occurring within the United States. And principally, they'd be over 1,000 miles to move to our railroad, but that's growing at 8 or 10% a year as a result of congestion on the highways, high diesel fuel prices, and again, the efficiency and service that we're able to provide. The key in terms of future intermodal growth will be how efficiently we can move shorter distances. And Judge Emmett was referring to Houston to Dallas. Well, that's about 250 miles, and typically that would be a truck length drive, but the question is, over time, can that begin to migrate to rail and get that traffic off the 45?
Russ, I think it's important to point out how change is constantly occurring in this industry. If you go back 25 or 30 years ago, trucks and railroads were competitors. I mean, there wasn't any way they were going to work together. And then suddenly some of the trucking firms realized, you know, it's a lot more efficient to put our trailer on the back of a train and move it that way. And so that's developed. And also 30 years ago, and I think Roger would back me up on this, at that time, intermodal freight was seen as not very productive for the railroads. So they didn't really want to fool with it. But as globalization continued, then more and more they looked up and said, you know what, there's money to be made here. And so what are the changes that are going to be in the next 30 years? We don't know, but I can guarantee you they're going to be there. And just like we're now talking about intermodal, it'll be interesting to see what changes come.
One of the key issues I think that this brings out between the trucking and the rail and the passenger rail is the interaction between the different modes. Yesterday, Sean and I, one of my colleagues from Dallas, were driving down and there was an accident on I-35, and it was the backup of trucks for 30 miles probably. It was huge on I-35 just south of Waco coming down this way. They were fortunately it was northbound and we made it in. But it showed the critical infrastructure there, how easily you could tie that up. But you don't really appreciate how many trucks there are until you see a wreck and you see them all backed up along this line mixed in with the cars. Similarly, in the high-speed rail, there's a lot of talk around the country about in passenger service, even with the transit agencies, is why don't you just use the tracks that are there for the freights? But the freights are carrying America's economy and lifeblood right there. And when you start throwing in 100 mile an hour, much less a 200 plus mile an hour system, it disturbs their operations. And we have to understand that as you go through and find ways to partner and work with them. In our case, in an isolated system, again, privately financed, and that gets into the whole, how are we paying for all this issue? Where do we use private money? Where do you use public money? But an isolated system that perhaps can run adjacent to or nearby and reduce the impact on the community, but still provide the services we need and let them do what they do best and allow then the collector-distributor systems of the transit agencies to interface as well. So it is a challenge, and it requires us to think a little differently than perhaps we have in the past and to educate people as we move forward with our projects.
If I can add to that, Russ, I'm very encouraged, if there are any legislators here, I'm very encouraged that it appears they're moving towards putting dedicated funds into the Rail Relocation and Improvement Fund. And that's something that was created in 2005, but no money was ever put into that. And if we can relocate some of the freight and have some money to be able to pay for that, and move some of the freight from outside of the core cities, that would be a tremendous effort, first step in addressing this issue. I think it would be good for not just the freight, but the entire traveling public through Texas.
Phil?
Air cargo is a very, very important part of the business for commercial airports in the state of Texas, and there's really two elements of it. The cargo that passenger carriers haul in the bellies of their plane, and then dedicated freight carriers, these very, very large airplanes that just circumnavigate the world all the time and touch down in DFW, drop off high-value goods, pick up high-value goods, and then continue on. The major elements of freight that we see through our airport are electronic devices, advanced manufactured devices, oil field drilling types of equipment, flowers, for example, coming in from the Netherlands, and perishable goods of that nature. But it's a very rapid growing part of our business, and one of our biggest constraints on growing it is the shortage that we're seeing in customs and border protection assets to process cargo. And it's a hugely important issue, not just for airports, but also for land ports here in the state of Texas.
On the non-containerized side of the port industry and its relationship to the other modes, ports in Texas and throughout the country, but particularly in Texas because of our energy and related mix, are starting to invest a lot of money in rail infrastructure and in connections to highways and rail, where 10 years ago that did not happen. It happened on the container side, particularly on the West Coast and the East Coast. But now you're starting to see significant dollars from Texas ports going into facilities to be able to handle unit trains, not just of containers, but as Roger mentioned, of oil. We have a new company in the Port of Corpus Christi that's an Italian PET manufacturer that makes the product for plastic bottles. They're going to spend $1 billion to build a plant, and they insisted on having it at a location where they would have 3 railroads. They wouldn't build it unless they had 3 railroads where they could access Mexico and the entire U.S. And they'll move 18,000 rail cars a year, 40 cars in, 40 cars out every day. So we were fortunate to get one of the Tiger grants recently. We had a lot of support from BN on that project. And
Happy to have the business.
The railroads are actually putting money into that. The port's putting money in, the federal government, and the railroads have committed to pay a user fee to help pay off the bonds that we're issuing for that.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about the public and private sector. And so how can they work better together to assure that we can continue to move people and goods throughout the state?
Well, I can start with that one. Transit supportive land use is critical in every community. I think a lot of the larger transit systems across the state are doing a very good job with that. Another thing I'm very encouraged about, just this week, the Austin City Council lifted a restriction on the minimum number of parking spaces that developers have to put in their projects in the downtown area, which not only saves money for those doing the development, but it also encourages alternative uses of transportation, especially transit. Transit-oriented development and the partnerships we're forming across the state with the private sector to have dense development at our transit nodes, major transit nodes, especially along rail lines, can be instrumental in helping transit shape the growth in our communities so that we're more efficient than we have been in the past. I know it's going to take a very long time for many, many Texans to adjust to or to get Texans out of their automobiles. In some cases, that will never occur, but the better we can do our planning with land use and the more attractive we can make transit, I think it will make us a more efficient state in terms of how we grow and how we use our scarce resources.
Well,
Judge Emmett?
you know, in the Harris County area, several of the counties have joined in the Gulf Coast Rail District, for example. And it doesn't have any taxing authority, but it will be the entity that can draw down grant funds and other things to make improvements to rail, not only for passenger commuter rail, but also for freight rail improvements. So, for example, in the Houston area, the rail has been there for 100 years or more, and the city's grown up around it. And there are a lot of instances where there can be improvements that will improve the flow of the freight rail system, but at the same time, there's benefit to the public in terms of eliminating grade crossings and thereby eliminating congestion. So I think you're going to see more and more a cooperative relationship where an entity like the Gulf Coast Rail District and its members, the counties that belong, and then the private railroads deciding we're willing to put this much money in to improve this rail line, and the benefit is 60% to the railroads and 40% to the public, so the railroads will pay 60% and the public will pay 40%. That's the only way to start getting things done, is to recognize that we are in this together, and if there's a public benefit and a private benefit, then both need to participate and not just point fingers at each other and say, well, you need to move that railroad, or vice versa.
I'd like to second Judge Emmett's philosophy there, and we see this kind of issue all over the country, but in Texas, there are a lot of projects that the public would like to see us go forward with that may or may not be of as much benefit to the private sector alone as they would be to the community as a whole. And so we've had a number of projects where we've had public participation in them. The most visible one in the state of Texas has been Tower 55 in downtown Fort Worth, where there were 2 east-west lines of the Union Pacific and our 2 north-south lines of our main line crossed at grade right in downtown Fort Worth. And that produced the biggest rail bottleneck in the country. And we've come up with a solution that was essentially $100 million, and it was paid a third by the public sector, a third by our railroad, and a third by the other railroad. And it took 10 years to get that put together and done, but we were able to, and we feel very good about that. And as you've heard, we've done other development projects with cities and ports, and those are very important. But as the state grows and population centers grow around transportation corridors, we need to recognize that improving those is a joint effort. It's not on both sides. And I applaud Judge Emmett for taking that view.
Go ahead.
Judge Nichols?
Texas has been a leader in public-private partnerships, and sometimes successful, sometimes controversial in the process. But a lot of it is going to depend upon changing the thought process on big infrastructure projects as well. Many times, as was mentioned a minute earlier, it's cheaper to relocate the railroad than it is to build the grade separations that are needed to improve mobility. And so there are ways to think outside the box that perhaps TxDOT is prohibited from using their money for railroads, yet at the same time, they could, for a much cheaper price, relocate that railroad and still get the road improvements they need to do. So the state needs to look at how they work. And then as we look at financing projects like ours, again, largely privately financed, high-speed railway between Houston and Dallas-Fort Worth, maybe ultimately Austin and San Antonio, those are all really strong markets in Texas. There will be places people will find where they'll want to connect and continue or interface with other modes of transportation, collector-distributor systems, and there'll be opportunities to, again, look, as Judge Emmett, and he's taken a real leadership role in this in the Houston region, on the public and the private sharing that cost and the benefits of the greater benefits to the community. So it's just going to take a different thought process than we've done, because as all of this discussion goes, it's about money. It's, we're moving people, but it's ultimately how do we pay for it, and that is going to have to change in the future from the way we've done it in the past.
Well, commercial airports are a great example of a public-private partnership that's been in place for a long, long time. And most commercial airports in Texas and around the country are owned by municipalities, or in our case, 2 municipalities. And the airports plan and design the facilities, both the airfield facilities as well as the terminals. And then we issue bonds using the authority of our cities, which are ultimately guaranteed by the airlines. And so, the trick in the airline business and the business model is to generate enough revenue through landing fees and terminal rents, and also through non-aviation related activities like commercial development and parking and concessions, food and beverage inside the terminals to pay off our debt. And so we have a lot of private sector stakeholders, and all commercial airports have a lot of private sector stakeholders that are involved in our success, particularly the airlines.
A subset of that is the relationship between different public entities also, not just private, as I said, with some of the rail infrastructure we're doing. But we've really seen in Texas ports, TxDOT take a much different role. Traditionally, TxDOT viewed itself, since its original name, as a highway department, but that's really evolved, I would say, over the last 15 years. We saw it originally back in 1995. I saw David Laney on the previous panel when he was head of chairman of TxDOT. We worked with TxDOT on getting funding for what was a freight road and rail. And at that time, that was almost unheard of with TxDOT. It didn't have the highway count. It didn't have the cars going over it. And it was a real struggle, but we got that. we parlayed that into the Italian company. That's where that company's going, on that section of the port that was unreachable before. And today you see TxDOT with a maritime director, with a freight director. Judge Emmett is head of the freight advisory panel that TxDOT just set up in the last few months. So they've really evolved into a multimodal entity that can help ports and communities, and I think that's important to recognize.
And the rail division as well, which
Yes.
has been one of our former employees is head of it, so we're pleased about that.
What are different issues or concerns that might limit our growth in the future, and how are we going to address those problems or different issues? As we can.
Well, for ports, it's sometimes for some ports, it's growth from the communities into traditional port areas. You have that in a lot of ports throughout the U.S., and we see it with the rail side also, where ports may have been there and rail may have been there for 80, 90, 100 years, and suddenly people like to be near water. They like to see that, they like that kind of activity. You start to see commercial and residential development. And when they do that, people don't want to see trains or hear trucks. They don't want to be stopped with crossings. They don't want noise. They don't want light from the facilities that are there. So that encroachment is a battle that most ports face and something that we all deal with.
And one of the big challenges we're seeing in our project today is the cost of building the project. Today we're at a really sweet spot as far as construction cost and cost of capital and right-of-way and those things for a project of the high-speed rail that we're working on. Again, this is a multi-billion-dollar project, $10 or $12 billion or more. And one of the critical challenges is how long is that cost of capital, which is a big part of our cost, going to remain where it is? And so the challenges that we face are the regulatory delays moving forward, the traditional mindset that this is a state type of project, not a private project. And again, we believe we can build it. Our experience at the county, our infrastructure director used to always joke that he could build the flood control projects twice as fast for half the money as they could if we didn't have the federal involvement. And I'm sure you see the same kind of issues in transit agencies. We don't look for federal money to build our project, but we are still falling under all the regulatory challenges that any other railroad faces. But even more so because it's a new technology. So I don't know the answer to that yet, but time is the enemy of any big infrastructure project, and I do think that we need to do some work on expediting, fast-tracking these kinds of big major changes that benefit our community, particularly when we're trying to take advantage of a window with a low cost of capital, because we've all been there too when interest rates are not at 2 or 3 or 5% and had to stretch the dollars even further.
I think the two things that are, we may as well, get the biggest issue out there right now. Two of the things that are going to restrict growth, first and foremost, is the lack of political will to raise the funds to pay for the infrastructure. It's just that simple. I mean, if the people who had been running Texas years ago had not developed the farm-to-market road system, had not developed the state highway system, then we wouldn't be enjoying this economic miracle that we have today. So the people who are in office today, all of us included, have to step up to the plate and say, look, it's not conservative to sit on what we have. The right thing to do is to invest for the future. And so you're going to hear that over and over and over throughout the day. But secondly, with what resources we do have, we have to make sure that the interconnectedness works. I'll give you an example. We could do commuter rail in the Hempstead corridor relatively easily in the Houston, Harris County, Waller County area. But right now, it comes into an abandoned rail yard and doesn't connect to Metro. Well, if Metro plans can change and connect to the commuter rail, then we can use that. And again, if you look back to the past, there were all kinds of rail lines. One paralleled Interstate 10, went straight into downtown, that if it were still available would be a wonderful commuter line, but it's not there. So my biggest concern is people not really looking to the future and instead just focusing on today.
I think that there are two issues facing the legislature right now, water and transportation, and if we're not able to deal with those long term, it will literally kill growth in many parts of the state. And even if the legislature were able to address these problems and come up with some solutions, I think at best it would be a Band-Aid. We really need some very long-term approaches to looking at this. It would be beneficial, I believe, for the state to allow the locals some more authority for funding options for transportation, whether it's sales tax, an increase in the gas tax, just the option to do that. I can give you an example that I think was pretty bold that the state of Georgia just recently did. You may be familiar with it. They divided the state up into 12 parts, 12 regions, and they let the locals come up with a list of their transportation priorities of all modes. Then they went out for a sales tax. It wasn't successful. They got a lot of Tea Party agitation in the mix, and it didn't pass. But I thought it was a bold and innovative approach, and making some really tough decisions for how to deal with transportation. And I think it's going to take something that bold, along with the political will, which we all know is very difficult.
Phil? We're facing three constraints on growth in the aviation business, and these are primarily federal issues. In the air, on the ground, and with our people. And when you look at how aircraft are navigated in this country, it all started out with the lighting of fires on top of hills and pilots sighting those fires, and that evolved into a ground-based terrestrial radar system, which is essentially what we have today. And what is occurring right now is the movement toward a satellite-based GPS system called NextGen, which the FAA is trying to implement. This system will increase landing capacity at airports all over the country, and it's especially critical in the Northeast and around New York and in those areas. But when you've got a clog in the system up there, it affects us here in Texas as well. So NextGen and the highway in the skies and making those more efficient is a big part of our growth management. The second has to do with making sure that we've got adequate airfield capacity and terminal capacity and gate capacity to accommodate all the flights that are going to be coming here to Texas, especially international. And these are financed through the charges that I mentioned earlier, but perhaps the most important charge that we have to accommodate growth is something called a passenger facility charge, which we're allowed to assess. It's at $4.50, and PFCs are how airports are going to be building additional facilities in the future. The PFC was used to build Terminal D in the Skylink system in Dallas and Fort Worth. It's assessed at the airport, and it's used for projects at the airport, but yet the federal government regulates it. That makes about as much sense as the federal government capping our state sales tax or local property taxes. So we're working on the PFC issue. And then the third issue relates to people. We have had to turn cargo flights away from DFW because we can't get Custom Border Protection staffing at our airport at the times that we need it. And those of you who travel internationally, you're seeing the queues build up in international gateway airports, in the international arrival halls because of the inadequacy of CBP staffing. Well, international is going to be where the growth will come from for all of our airports, and if we don't address the people constraint at our airports, our passengers will continue to be inconvenienced, and we're working that very hard in Washington.
Just from our perspective, I'd like to echo that land use as Texas grows is becoming a bigger problem. Now, we don't see the same kind of objections to growth in Texas that we would in places like California or Washington State. And so we really haven't seen that, although there, as Judge Emmett was saying, there are conflicts between neighborhoods and freight right now. And in a former life, I worked with both Judge Eccles and Judge Emmett in Houston on issues that came up there. And so I think as Texas continues to grow, that will become a bigger problem. And just on the passenger side, a few years ago I was on the 2030 committee with several people in this room and on the podium here, and I remember observing in the course of the hearings that it didn't strike me that Texas realized how big its cities were, which I know is going to sound funny because Texas always knows how big it is, but the urban areas in this state have grown so big and are so large that are 5, 6, 7 million people that I think the challenges facing it and the mobility needs are different than a lot of the policymakers, at least back then, I think may have thought that they were.
Yeah.
That kind of leads into my next question.
Russ, just to add on that,
Let's go ahead, Judge Emmett.
put it in perspective, Harris County has more people in 24 states.
And DFW is approaching 7 million people
Right.
in the metropolitan area, and that was just as a new Texan, that was an observation I made several years ago.
And it's interesting too, as Ed talks about that a lot of that is inner city growth that was discussed earlier about moving people back into the inner city, and that increases congestion too. Everybody says, oh, the sprawl means congestion. Well, that may be congestion on freeways, but the congestion on Kirby Drive, on Shepherd Drive, on the inner city inside the 610 loop streets has gotten so much more as the density increases, and it not just provides the opportunity, but forces people into those transit alternatives down the line.
So are all these approaches we've done in the past scalable for the future? Or as we've talked about all these problems, are there things that we should do differently to deal with these issues as we move forward? You've mentioned several problems here, so how do we deal with this?
I'll give a couple of examples, and since I represent Harris County, I'm going to be Harris County centric. If you look at the rail line that's known as the Terminal Sub, it runs between West University and Bel Air. It's inside Loop 610, so I think everybody's familiar with Loop 610 in Houston. That's a Union Pacific line. It was put there back, I believe, in the early 30s for one reason, to get it completely outside the city of Houston. It didn't quite work. The other one I would mention, and this ties to the airport, those who have traveled internationally know almost any international airport you go to, it's really simple to go get on a train and go to downtown or go to whatever area. If you look at Houston, there are no plans to tie Bush Intercontinental by rail. And I'm not sure how it could be done at this point. It's very, very difficult. But those are the kind of long-range things that we need to think about.
I think, aviation and intermodalism that relates to aviation is going to be very important for the state. And our friend Walt Heumann is here, who had a key role in establishing DART in the North Texas region. And DART will be arriving at DFW in December of next year. And we're going to be delighted to have that transit connection into the east side of the Metroplex. It'll be coming into the west side of the Metroplex from the T in Fort Worth a couple years after that. But surface transportation is also critical to the success of airports as well. And Michael Morris mentioned earlier he can make a 45-minute or 30-minute trip from McKinney to DFW Airport because of the road infrastructure that we have. And we've got the DFW connector going on at the north end of the airport, over $1 billion project. And then as soon as that one's done, the 183 corridor redesign is going to start at the south end of the airport. Well, our customers' experience begins when they leave their front door. And, they will decide whether to go to Love Field or DFW, or people in Houston will decide whether to go to Hobby or Bush based on the quality and the access that surface transportation provides. So this intermodal approach and high-speed rail is also in the mix in terms of the conversation of what may happen around airports in the future is going to be something that I think we'll approach differently in the future.
I want to move a little bit to some of the port issues, and what impact will the improved Panama Canal have on our transportation modes in the state? Judge Emmett, you want to go first?
Well, since I chaired the Panama Canal Stakeholder Working Group, I guess I get to start with that. There's no question it's going to have an impact, but we had to get past the Chamber of Commerce rah-rah. The original thing was, the Panama Canal is going to expand. All these ships are going to come to the Texas ports, and there will be some of that, but the truth of the matter is, if you just look at the logistics of coming from Asia through the Panama Canal, currently those ships offload for the most part in LA Long Beach and go to rail. And then they're railed, 5 days, Roger, anywhere in the country pretty much, once a box is unloaded. For them to bypass LA Long Beach and come to a Texas port is a 22-day round trip. It's an extra 11 days through the Panama Canal. And what a lot of people don't look at is if you exit the Panama, or as you exit the Panama Canal, you're east of Texas. So there will be some of that, and shipping lines never cease to amaze me with the way they come up with their plans. But there will be some ships that come from Asia. But more importantly are going to be the exports. As John mentioned, LNG can't fit through the Panama Canal right now. We suddenly find ourselves with a lot of gas. It's going to be important. Asia needs that energy. Those LNG tankers can come from Texas and go through, and that'll be big. Likewise, coal exports. Coal producers are going to want to continue selling their coal, and if they're not going to sell it here, they're going to sell it to Asia. And the West Coast coal export facilities, for the most part, are in areas where the environmental community aren't real happy with them. And so Kinder Morgan has already announced a huge coal export facility in Houston. So I think the Panama Canal is going to be more important largely for exports at the beginning, but then that doesn't take into consideration South America. If the west coast of South America trade with the United States really comes up, then all of that can come through the Panama Canal. So it will have an impact, and it's something that we need to pay attention to. But I would be remiss if I didn't point out that more and more of our trade is going to come from the Indian subcontinent. And that trade is going to come through the Suez Canal, and that's where we're perfectly positioned to take advantage of it to come to the Gulf Coast.
If I could add, I mean, I think our company thinks that you won't see a huge impact of the Panama Canal on day one, that over time, over a generation, it's hard to predict what the impact of new transportation infrastructure is, but we think freight flows are relatively well established. So I think I would agree with most of what Judge Emmett said, that it's unlikely that you're going to see a burst of new containers coming to the Port of Houston or Corpus Christi on day one just because of the cost on the water, the nature of where the markets are going, the infrastructure that's there. I would say that, you know, one of the things that we are looking at extensively is what is the cost of freight versus the cost of labor, and how is that migrating manufacturing from Asia back to North America and to Mexico? And so what we think you might see more of is our maquiladoras along the border and more land trade between the U.S. and Mexico, which is kind of unrelated to the Panama Canal, but some will come back, some will stay over, and wage rates over time in China are rising, and wage rates in Mexico are relatively stagnant. And obviously, when you add in the logistics costs, Mexico may become a more attractive manufacturing location, in addition to U.S. looking at exporting commodities in a way that it hadn't in several generations. I think all of those will make for unpredictable freight flows, but Texas will be right in the middle of them.
You know, one of the things I think you hear as you talk about this is that it emphasizes the need for the regions in the state to work more closely together on our infrastructure, that the Port of Houston, the Port of Corpus, they're the ports for San Antonio and Austin and Dallas. And so the folks in the Dallas-Fort Worth region don't typically think of what's going on at the Port of Houston, do we care? But they do. And as those areas grow and it drives the cost of business, the cost of goods, to be able to come to a big port like Houston or access Corpus Christi, makes our cost of doing business cheaper and more competitive than other parts of the world in Dallas-Fort Worth, which means there's more people up there, but they need to get back to their business partners in Houston on a high-speed train, or they need to get their cargo back and forth on a plane, or the high-value cargo on the planes, or the other infrastructure. So it's more and more going to talk about groups like this, people like Michael working with people like Ed at the HDAC and the Texas Department of Transportation, of how we work better intra-regionally as opposed to just looking intra-regionally at things like traffic congestions that a Cap Metro or Houston Metro would work towards.
I'd agree with comments from both judges and Roger, and I think the positive that we really have to emphasize for Texas is we're not talking about just bringing in product importing. We're talking really about Texas being export driven, and that's a good thing not only for Texas because it creates a lot of jobs here in all sorts of industries, but it also creates jobs in our community and helps the overall economy. One of the things that we're trying to do, along with what Judge Eccles said, is we've formed a rather loose association with Port San Antonio and Port Laredo, which are inland port. Port San Antonio is the former Kelly Air Force Base. Got tremendous air capability, also warehousing and distribution. Laredo is the largest freight-related land port in the U.S. It's a tremendous economic driver for this country. So we're working together trying to do joint marketing. We don't compete. While the cities may compete in different areas, we've just kept it focused on the ports and tried to work together to stimulate trade in that South Texas triangle.
Well, this is a related topic, and we talked about this earlier with shale movements, but how is that impacting our railroads and our ports across the state?
Well, I can speak to what we are doing, and that our energy-related businesses involving inbound pipe, frac sand, and shale fracking chemicals, and then outbound unit trains of oil are from virtually non-existent 5 years ago will be probably one of our largest business units, and we'll have almost 200 unit trains of crude oil a day, and that's just from the Bakken shale that we're looking at. So that's 400,000-ish barrels, and that's from North Dakota. What's been interesting is how, we know a lot of folks in the energy industry in the DFW area, and they kind of laughed at the idea of crude by rail a few years ago, saying, how in the world could you possibly ever move crude by rail? Why would anybody ever do that? And what people didn't foresee was the glut of energy in the U.S. and how that would create essentially an arbitrage ability depending on where your refineries were and where they were importing crude from. And rail, because it could go anywhere, pipelines can only go where pipelines go, and usually trucks laugh at us for the same reason that we can only go where our tracks go, but because pipelines can only go on the pipeline route, we were able to we move crude to refineries in Philadelphia, we move them to the Gulf Coast, we move it to Cushing, we move it to the Pacific Northwest, and that has just created an entire market basically in crude that has accrued to our benefit and to the consumers because they're getting lower prices. So it's really been a tremendous opportunity. The second thing I would say, and just to echo some comments about Texas being an exporting country, is that we think that the shale revolution will keep natural gas prices low, at least for the foreseeable future. And as a result of that, energy-intensive manufacturing industries are going to locate back to the United States, and the hub of that is on the Texas Gulf Coast. And so Texas we think will see a big increase, and you've already heard reference to several plans to expand manufacturing in Texas because the infrastructure is already there. So we think that as a primary effect, Texas produces a lot of gas and oil, and as a secondary effect, because it has so many manufacturing facilities that are energy dependent, Texas will benefit more than any other state from that, except maybe Western North Dakota, which I don't think anyone wants to trade places with.
Russ, let me give you.
Maybe you do.
Let me give you an example. The Port of Victoria, which a lot of people don't realize Victoria is a port, but it is, and it's on the Intercoastal Waterway, which is another transportation infrastructure that we need to pay attention to. When the Eagleford came in, they just boomed because frac sand was coming in by rail, going out by truck, and then the oil, a lot of it that's not going on trains and other methods because there aren't pipelines, it's being trucked out of the Eagleford to Victoria and put on a barge and taken over to Houston or to Corpus or to various places. So that's a place where you look up and you go, wow, we would never have seen that coming. But we're glad that canal is there, because otherwise we wouldn't have been able to move it. But secondarily, to Roger's point about the price of natural gas being low, you have facilities there that are chemical plants that use natural gas as a feedstock, and suddenly they are booming and they're exporting all over the world, whereas their competitors had been just sort of beating their socks off for years. Now they're competitive, and plants that had been downsized are suddenly reinvesting. So that's important.
Give you an example of what can happen with shale oil, Eagleford Shale. Valero has a refinery that sits right in the middle of the shale oil formation in Three Rivers, which is about halfway between San Antonio and Corpus Christi. And that facility was kind of limping along, making it. It was fed through the Port of Corpus Christi. They had New Star, which was a spin-off from Valero, had 4 large tanks. They'd bring in a crude carrier, imported oil, dump it in those tanks, pipe it to the refinery in Three Rivers. With Eagleford, that refinery has gone from 95% imported oil to 100% U.S. crude from within 20 miles of their refinery. And what New Star has done, that didn't sit empty. New Star's reversed that pipeline. So they're collecting, they've built, if you drive down 37, you'll see development you never saw before. They built storage tanks all throughout the Eagleford. They pipe it to those tanks in Corpus, and they send it to other facilities, other terminals in the U.S., and Valero has taken the additional step of getting a permit from the U.S. government to be able to export crude to refineries in Quebec. Most people don't know you cannot export U.S. crude to another country. It's against the law.
Except Canada.
Well, you can get a special permit for Canada. That's it. And BP and Valero have gotten them. And to follow up on the judge's point of the intercoastal waterway, that facility is tremendous for all the ports in Texas and for the energy industry and the grain industry and others that move by barge. It's only supposed to be 12 feet deep. The problem is the federal government has let it go, and it's only to 9 feet deep. So we're losing 1/3 of the capacity of the intercoastal because the federal government hasn't kept up with the maintenance on some of the locks and with dredging of what needs to be done there. There's significant effort. Again, the state's taken a leadership role in going to Washington trying to get the funding. But that impacts everybody because we're losing capacity where it should be.
I was going to mention, shale and natural gas development has been a boon for many airports in the state as well. At DFW, we have almost 18,000 acres of land. It's about the size of Manhattan. And in 2004, we signed a development agreement and received a bonus payment of about $184 million. And we used it to pay back our owner cities every cent they ever put into the airport. And we did about $50 million worth of terminal improvements. And we continue to use that royalty stream to keep our landing fees low. And so when we go out and compete against Chicago, Atlanta, and other airports around the country for air service, shale is helping us keep our landing fees low and help us be more competitive.
I'm going to move now to some passenger rail issues and how do high-speed rail and commuter rail and other types of regional passenger rail fit into the transportation network and with our local transit services?
Well, starting out with high-speed rail, again, it doesn't really exist in the United States today. You've got Acela that runs about 150 miles an hour, but on a global discussion of high-speed rail, that's a higher speed type of service. The service we look at is a 205 mile an hour service. Again, it is expensive to build, and it is a private sector initiative to move this project forward. It's a little different thought process because revenue has to exceed costs. When I was the judge, we had taxpayers, and they had to buy. And if they didn't, we had agents that could go collect from them. As a private company, much as BNSF, you'll hear their experiences, the people have choices. And if they get too high on their prices, they'll move to trucks or use UP or somebody. So we're in that same situation. We have to work with the local communities to interconnect with the transportation system so that efficiently people can move on and off of our system and get around the community. What we hear repeatedly as I travel around the world looking at other rail systems, high-speed rail systems, is people tell me, well, you don't have a collector-distributor system like we have in France or Germany or Tokyo or Korea. And they're right, we don't have a collector-distributor system like theirs. We have a collector-distributor like Texas, and it's called a freeway. And so initially we have to have access to those roads that people use to get in and out and around the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex and the Houston region, and ultimately Austin and San Antonio perhaps. But in the longer term, as Cap Metro, as DART, as the T, as Houston Metro continue to build out their infrastructure for transportation alternatives, we need to be future-proof so that we can access, as Ed mentioned, Intercontinental Airport. No plans have been made. We've actually had discussions with Intercontinental about interconnecting there, as with the DFW airport. And Dallas-Fort Worth, Michael, has really planned how they interact all these different modes together much better than Houston has, at least for the high-speed rail systems. We've got commuter rail and light rail and high occupancy bus type projects underway. But the high-speed rail does have the capacity, if we can do it right as we interact with our local transportation partners in the communities, of being transformational. When I first started looking at this project, there was a trade mission. The Houston mayor or someone was taking a trade mission to Angola, and I was joking with some friends, as we would do, about, I bet there's more trade opportunities in Dallas than there is in Angola. And sure enough, Ray Perryman, if you call him, he'll tell you those things. And he said, nobody ever asked that question. I said, well, it's a common currency and a similar language. I bet we can make things work. And started working then with County Judge Lee Jackson. And we found that there was very little effort at trying to work together to build our mutual interests and economies. High-speed rail will transform that. It will make it possible to, again, commute between the two cities. There's over 50,000 people a day going back and forth between Houston and Dallas-Fort Worth. It will make it possible to create business opportunities, ties with your families and friends. You can watch baseball in air-conditioned comfort if you live in Dallas the way it was meant to be watched. And you can probably watch the playoffs in Dallas, which we don't get to do in Houston very often. So it's an opportunity to shrink the state and allow us all to work more closely together to grow and build our economy and jobs and again, be a leader not just for Texas, but for America and the world.
Well, there's no question that interconnectivity is crucial to high-speed rail. You don't want people pouring out the system at the end of the line into the local community with no way to get to their final destination. So I see it working similar to the phone lines right now. You have your long-distance network for calls, and then as they move to the local level, you have your local carriers. It's seamless, it's smooth. I think the legislature should require it, and the locals should make it a high priority because it won't work without it. So that connection is crucial.
If I could just say, a lot of high-speed and passenger rail is meant to be put on freight lines. And at our company, many other railroads just simply don't want passengers on their lines. And candidly, we're a freight railroad. We're not a passenger railroad. But at our company, we are willing to engage in the public discussion about this, but only if a few conditions are met. And many people on the podium here are familiar with them. And there's a few basic ones. The first is that it preserves our capacity. And what happens in a lot of parts of the country is they walk out and see a rail line and there's no train coming, and they say, well, let's have a passenger train. And you have to remember that it's really a one-lane road, and if you have one going 40 or 60 or 80 or 200 miles an hour and one going 20, think of when you're driving at 40 miles an hour and the truck in front of you is going 5 miles an hour, how that works. It doesn't really work very well. So it requires a lot of infrastructure capacity to have reliable, safe passenger rail that coexists with freight rail, and there's a limit to how fast at least freight rails think a passenger rail can coexist with them. Secondly is liability, and that's not always a glamorous subject and one people don't want to talk about, but there are accidents that happen on passenger lines, and our owners can't be the insurers of passengers and passenger service. And so we won't allow passenger service on our line unless our owners are indemnified for that. And that just is. It is what it is. And with those basic parameters, we have been able to do passenger deals all over the country, in Chicago and Minneapolis, Seattle, Los Angeles, Denver, and there are folks looking at it in Texas. So we have found ways to get to yes on that, but it's not as simple, I think, as sometimes people like to think it is, where you walk out and look at the rail line and say, let's put passenger on here.
BNS has been very, very helpful in educating us about those issues. And you look at particularly liabilities, we talk about derailments and passenger trains and the accidents they have. And again, the technology that we're looking at has gone nearly 50 years with zero loss of life accidents. They don't have derailments. Even in major earthquakes, they may have a little slip, but nothing serious. But it's a different experience than really anybody else in the world. But at the same time, the freights don't have that record. And so it's not just our issue, it's what happens with the freight cars. And we're very sensitive to that and working and trying to develop safety standards that will allow the proximity, at least, to be close together, if not the shared tracks, again, because our system is totally isolated, no interaction with cars or trucks or other trains. It's a barrier-free system, and again, the safest railroad in the world.
I know we're running real short of time here, so I'll try and be brief. If you saw the panel before us, The reality is we're not going to continue to build lanes of highways that can accommodate all the growth in terms of passengers. We're going to have to look at rail. We're going to have to look at commuter rail and high-speed rail, but it's got to tie to something. And I'll give you my fun example. Cap Metro, I guess they have the rail line that goes all the way to Giddings now, or could have access to it. We're talking about commuter line to Hempstead. Well, TxDOT, I believe, is studying putting the rail line back in between Hempstead and Giddings. That's almost a perfect city pair, not for high-speed rail necessarily,
High-speed too.
but for, because no offense to the airlines, by the time you go to the airport and take off your shoes and all that, it's not worth flying, so I end up driving. Well, even if it took a little longer, I'd take the train, and think about this, the train from Houston to Austin would come in right here, which is very close to 6th Street. Enough said. You could have great party trains going back in the late night. But I think rail has got to be part of the future, and we've got to find a way to make it work.
Well, I want to thank our panel today. We have had a great discussion. There are many more issues we could talk about, but you can't cover them in the amount of time that we had allotted. So if y'all would join me in thanking our expert panel today.
Good.